Oh, I didn't see you there. Oh, you nearly put the heart crossways in me. Anyway, sit down, have a cup of tea, and welcome to Literary as Feck.
Wow, it's getting frighteningly elaborate.
Yes, yeah. Eventually, it'll be the whole show. Will just be me leading up to saying, it'll be like It's in Monty Python.
Oh, the It's man.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with someone prodding you with an off-screen spear.
Yeah.
All
right.
All right, you are there. It is indeed Literary as Feck. There's no word of a lie. Welcome back, where we talk books and such.
Yep,
and
books.
Pretend that we're clever.
Yes.
Not really.
That we're well read. No, not at all.
And so this time, well, it was your choice.
Sure.
What did you choose for our delectation? Is that a word?
Sure. Okay. Sure. Why not? So this week's book is Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell, whose real name is Eric Arthur Blair, I think, right. But his pen name was George Orwell. And it's a book I read many, many years ago, probably when I was 21, when I was a young anarchist. And it had a pretty big effect at the time. I'd read a bunch of his books around the same time. I'm sure, like everybody else. Actually, I think a lot of people probably read. Here, answer this question. What was the first George Orwell book you ever read, Clive?
I think Animal Farm, because we did it in school.
Yes.
When I was, I don't know, 12 or something like that, 12, 13 maybe.
Yeah, I have a feeling it might have been the first one I read too. It's that or 1984. I don't remember.
Yeah, same here. And I think I would have read 1984 kind of around the same time. I don't think we were assigned that, but I think I just picked it up by myself.
And I think I was assigned it. I think in grade 11, maybe in high school in Canada. And I think we did that, and we did Brave New World, kind of as a comparative dystopian futures kind of a thing.
Interesting. Now that you mention it, Brave New World was part of my education. As I'm wondering if they did a similar. I don't know. I don't remember much from that period. I don't know why.
You were doing too much Soma. What was that? The drug from Brave New World?
I'd say I don't even remember that. Just to clarify as well, I'm guessing by your comfortable middle class background behind you there, you're no longer an anarchist. You gave up on that.
No, I think very much I still am. But I don't man the barricades, and I'm not at that many protests. But I still believe that authority is almost always the road to ruin. Which is kind of funny. We were just talking about this a moment ago. But anytime you have hierarchy, you have the capacity for somebody to abuse that hierarchy. I'm still pretty egalitarian at heart. I just don't have the time to put those things into practice very often.
A committed anarchist who too busy.
But yeah, so I think I probably read around the same time I read Down and Out in Paris and London, which is an earlier book by Orwell. And that's what's fascinating to me is that, and because at a certain point in Homage to Catalonia, Orwell mentions the fact that he is like a published novelist who has gone off to fight in the trenches in Spain. Right. And he mentions, like, sorry to anyone I haven't responded to your fan mail, but all of my stuff got stolen at this point in Spain, which is an amazing thing. It made me think of all those artists and poets who were lost in World War I as well, that there was this time when, like, people of letters, when painters and stuff would just be like, yep, I'm going to go off and fight.
Right. Well, it's interesting because it seems to particularly have really rallied the left, right? The Spanish Civil War Franco's kind of rise really seems to have mobilized in a way which is surprising, because you think people would have still have had that hangover and been kind of fed up from the First World War,
right?
But I'm wondering if one of the reasons, because particularly, well, from all over Europe, but there seem to be a lot of people from the UK, and I'm wondering if it might have been because the First World War never quite reached the UK in the same way as it did during the Second World War
France,
with
yeah.
Blitz and everything, right? So
Yes.
maybe we hadn't quite had our fill. I know, but it's strange. I mean, just to put it into a historical context, I'm wondering if the the galvanizing thing might have been Guernica.
Yeah, that would have been a big part of it. But I also think that, you know, at the time you have, you know, Hitler's kind of that version of fascism that's arisen in Germany, and then you've got Italy and Mussolini, and in both of those countries, the kind of the people, and it's not that there was no resistance. There was resistance in Germany, and there was resistance in Italy for sure. But it did seem like, generally speaking, the population was kind of like, oh, I guess this is happening now, you know, and you know, whereas in Spain, because you had this really strong, especially in Catalonia, in northern Spain, this really strong anarchist and communist kind of ethic that had been there for quite a long time. As soon as it erupts in South Spain, there's an immediate like, no, we are not having this. And then the rest of the world kind of has to kind of sit up and take notice. Oh, these people are not okay with this happening. And you get the, you know, international brigades, these people coming from all over the world. I mean, one of the craziest stories, and one of my favorite stories about the Spanish Civil War, is on the docks in Ireland. A bunch of hardline, I don't know if they were Catholics or if they were, maybe they were. Anyway, a bunch of people volunteered to go fight on the side of Franco, and a bunch of people went to volunteer to fight on the side of the anarchists and the communists, and they booked them for the same boat. So they all showed up because it's Ireland, right? Then why not? Nobody thought that was a bad idea. So for the Spanish Civil War, for the Irish started on the docks in, you know, Dunleary or something like that, with people having a fist fight before they even got on the boat to get to Spain. But yeah, you know, so when Orwell kind of signs up to go,
I hear you're fighting for that Franco fella. Is that right?
Exactly. Be Jesus.
Wouldn't he be one of them bad men?
So yeah, I think that, you know, you've got all this kind of volunteers and people going over there, because I really think people felt like this is the last stand. If we don't stand up to it here, you know, I mean, well, that's almost the last line of the whole book, is like, it's coming, you know, like, yes, we can't, you know, we can, and it's quite chilling actually, because it's 3 years before.
Well, yeah, like I mentioned, the Battle of Britain. That's exactly. Actually, I'll quote it because it's worth.
Yeah.
It is. It's.
Yeah, spoiler alert to everybody. There was a Second World War.
Yes, just in case you didn't know. Yeah, so I'm not gonna, because it's a fairly. Actually, I will if I read.
Yeah, go ahead.
Down here, it was still, so that he's returned basically home. Down here, it was still the England I had known in my childhood, the railway cuttings smothered in wildflowers, the deep meadows where the great shining horses browse and meditate, the slow-moving streams bordered by willows, the green bosoms of the elms, the larkspurs in the cottage gardens, and then the huge, peaceful wilderness of outer London, the barges on the miry river, the familiar streets, the posters telling of cricket matches and royal weddings, the men in bowler hats, the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, the red buses, the blue policemen, all sleeping the deep, deep sleep of England, for which I sometimes fear that we shall never wake till we are jerked out of it by the roar of bombs. Which is a beautiful piece of writing, but
yes,
I believe if we're literary as Feck, I believe that's prescient as Feck.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, it's terrifyingly on the nose. I also love right before that, there's a little line where he mentions, like, you know, we read about earthquakes in Japan and revolutions in Mexico, and they don't touch us. Like they're outside of our experience. And just that earthquakes in Japan was a strange thing to read in an Orwell book from 1936.
The other line in that I really like as well is, he lists, and the one that really strikes me is he says, the industrial towns of the north were far away, a smudge of smoke and misery hidden by the curve of the earth's surface. That's yes. This is why Orwell is the man, right? I mean,
yes.
I do apologize for mangling Orwell in my crap recitation, but I think he survives even me reading it out very badly.
No, I thought you read very well. But I think that when I read it first, I probably was most interested in the stuff, and I'm about to say this word wrong. How do you say that? Internecine, like the battles that take place within an organization or a group or a side.
Nisine, I've heard.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sure. That's probably right, because it's one of those words I don't think I've ever heard read aloud.
No, it's either you only hear it in terms of this, or there's that film with it in the title, right?
Okay. Right.
I can't even remember what that film is, but there's a film with a word in it as well.
Okay. But I really probably focused in on those parts that were around, because I was really interested in the history of anarchism in Spain.
Right.
And all of those group names. There's the CNT, which is the anarchist trade union, which was huge in northern Spain and in Barcelona, and then the FAI, which was the basically the federation, the anarchist federation of Iberia, and they were kind of the militant wing of the CNT. And then you've got the organization or the group that he joins, which is the POUM. Home.
Well, when they'd march in and they'd go, "You've been pwned."
Right, nice.
That's where that phrase comes from.
Okay, and they're sort of a Trotskyist. Well, they get accused of being Trotskyist, but they're certainly a more revolutionary form of communism than the Stalinists. And then there's also the PSUC, who are more the Stalinist kind of version of communism. And basically, there ends up being this massive power struggle in northern Spain between these, all at the same time as they're supposed to be fighting against Franco and fascism. And that stuff really fascinated me as a younger reader. But coming back to the book now, I think possibly because I know all of that because I've read multiple other books about the Spanish Civil War.
Okay.
What interested me most was actually his just descriptions of going to the front lines, of fighting, of being in the street fighting in Barcelona. Those interstitial political chapters were less interesting to me now.
It's for me, because I was the first time reading, and also because the one thing that struck me while reading this book was I was struck by my own how little I know about the Spanish Civil War. It's one of the things I was under no illusion. I didn't think I was an expert on it by any means, but I figured I kind of had a I kind of know what the Spanish Civil War is about. And then as soon as I got into it, I was like, oh man, I have no context, whether it be just geographical in terms of which parts of the country different things were, like very simple things like that. I had no cause in the past to actually look on a map of Spain and,
forget where the Aragon front would have been. Yeah,
and like you said, I had a vague notion of, because I'd read a little bit about Homage to Catalonia before reading it, and also there's a very good on YouTube. There's a very good 5-part BBC Arena series from the 80s on George Orwell. I don't know if you've seen that.
I saw it many years ago, but I haven't seen it recently.
I rewatched it, and it's a great it's a really nice primer on Orwell, I think, if anyone's interested in kind of delving in. So, but I wasn't at a disadvantage, I think, because like you said, I think what this book is fascinating, both in its specificity, but also what it says about not so much wars in general, although that's in there as well, but more about how the fog of war kind of clouds our ultimate judgment of actually what went down.
Yes, and the different political lines and the kind of, and just the outright lying, and then he admits himself that he is partisan, and that he also, he's not an omniscient narrator. He was very much in a specific place at a specific time, and he can only report what he saw and experienced.
That's what makes him. I mean, I knew this about Orwell anyway, but I think specifically reading this, I really, I've always liked Orwell. I've always admired Orwell, and whether it be 1984 or Down and Out or Burmese Days or that brilliant essay he wrote about his days in public school, such were the joys. Such a
which I don't think I've read that yet, so I'll get to that.
It's great, but specifically with this one, I was so he's there's a reason, for instance, people like Christopher Hitchens, just admire the he's I can't think of how many writers are. I don't quite even know how to articulate it. It's not so much that he's honest to a fault, like, it's not so much that he tells it exactly how he sees it, but on top of that, he even manages to acknowledge that when he does have a bias, like it doesn't get past him. Like he
Right.
he has fucking X-ray vision or something.
Yes.
Like nothing gets past him in terms of like, oh, this might, and it's all there, but it's not belabored either. It's in amazingly spare prose.
Yes.
Which is, I'm not quite sure how he does it. It's like a weird alchemy or magic trick or something, but done by just being utterly simple.
Yes, and he actually wrote about writing. There's quite a good essay by Orwell, I think it's just called On Writing, and he talks about that was always his aim, was to make prose like as clear as a window pane, where there was no guesswork. I will mean what I say, and I'll say what I mean, and it'll be abundantly clear to the reader. You're not going to have to try to figure it out.
Right.
He's never going to use writing to kind of make things, to obfuscate things. It was always going to be to communicate.
No, it's remarkable, and I've read as well how he was, and I'd never really put two and two together before, but he was obviously quite influenced by Jack London as well, right?
Yes. I think The Iron Heel, which is Jack London's, which I've never read, but that's his 1984.
Yes, I think we might do that actually on the show, maybe.
That's a great idea, because I love Jack London as well. And that was definitely one of the influences on.
Right, but beyond that specific, I think in terms of things like, for instance, Martin Eden or more reportage,
right,
is and the two of them as well. I mean, Jack London was, I suppose, at one point was the most famous man in the world anyway, right? So not so much now maybe, but he was like a proper mega star, right, in his time, right? But over the years,
whereas the brand Homage to Catalonia sold like 686 copies or something like that. Yeah, it was an absolute failure, as were really most of his books in his lifetime.
Right. But the other thing as well, and it's amazing, it's like, so on top of that, he brings all that, but then he doesn't forget to also bring a certain artist. Like there's some beautiful passages. I'm not going to do this because, as you can see, there's so many of these.
Right.
I can't even find that. I have to paraphrase. There's little bits that are just like he mentions coming across like one village which looks like the buildings look as if someone's rolled a dice. And wow. And this is the great bit when he's in a military hospital and he talks about some soldier with an infection or something had emerald green urine.
Yes.
And it was the wonder of the war.
Lord, yes. God, there's a beautiful turn of phrase. Disturbing bit in there too, where to describe somebody who has this kind of muslin contraption around their head, so that like just describing how I guess they were trying to air out the wounds. They had reached a point where they thought that was the best medical practice, which it could well be, but then you had to see these kind of disgusting jellied like kind of wounds in the process of healing. But I guess
he refers to his own, I really like this as well, he refers to his own very bad Spanish as my villainous Spanish. I love the idea of setting yourself up in opposition to when it comes to this language, I'm the bad guy of the story because my Spanish is so bad. I'm the villain of the piece. That's fucking great.
Interesting. One of the figures in the book is a guy called, I think it's George Kopp, who was maybe Belgian, was one of these people who had, one of the things that's interesting of the Spanish Civil War too is that basically, you have all these people go to Spain from other countries, from America, from Ireland, from France, even from Germany, like basically from Italy, countries where there were successful fascist governments. And then like a bit later on, like after World War II, when everyone's done fighting fascism, these people end up getting kind of rounded up and you know, because they were like, they fought fascism too early, because it basically marked them as being communists, because it was largely leftists who did that.
Right.
They were kind of what, you know, there was a specific word they used for it, but basically it's not coming to me now. But yeah, but basically they had gone too, they'd fought fascism too early. You know, we weren't all doing that then.
Right.
And so, but he apparently, because the book kind of leaves you with a bit of a question mark, because he gets thrown in jail when they're doing this kind of
really
pogrom against the poem or the poem. But he did in fact get out. I looked him up because I was just interested to see what happened, and he ended up doing all kinds of crazy stuff afterwards. And apparently, Orwell had an open marriage, and so he was sleeping with Orwell's wife.
Okay.
Which is not brought up in the book. Obviously, that was not something he thought.
Another, so much going on with Orwell.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think they even touch on, and everything else is pretty much, they don't even touch on that in that Arena series, for example. I don't think they
right
at all.
Yeah.
They might do. I can't remember. I haven't got to the last episode. They might, because I've learned it from somewhere, and so. But the other thing, it's interesting how that, it seems to be something that the meat grinder effect, where you know, the other factions are quickly thrown under the bus. How quickly that seems to be something that it seems to be specific, comes into leftist revolution. It happened with the French Revolution. It happened here. It happened certainly later on with the Stalinist in Stalinism. So there seems to be something ingrained more so than in fascist revolutions, I think, where, you know, there's this thing comes in where everything gets splintered very, very quickly, and whoever end up at the top of the pile, everyone else, you know, denounces everyone else. And that happened here in great speed, right? Like, still as the war is going on, in a way, there's people turning on it. There's this bit where he mentions, like, when he's on the front, everyone's kind of united, and then as soon as they get back to, you know, so-called, you know, civilization, or that's when things get really nasty, right? When when there's no actual fighting involved, when people are just not seeing the result of what their talk you know, instigates, you know, that's the worst in a way, right?
I mean, I do think that, I mean, historically speaking, so there's a major divergence that obviously happens on the left between the version of kind of state communism that Trotsky and Lenin put in Russia. You know, I mean, when the Russian Revolution starts, there is this great excitement from leftists all around the world, including anarchists and people who are more kind of libertarian, on the libertarian side of the left. And, you know, Emma Goldman, who is a, you know, famous American anarchist, she goes over to Russia to kind of, you know, to watch. And there's a pretty quick disillusionment with the way that the Russians take their revolution, right? That it becomes extremely hierarchical, extremely centralized. They have like, they go from basically, there's like, you know, multiple different pay grades. It's super bureaucratic. It's not really the utopia that kind of anarchists are hoping for. And obviously the argument being made is that, well, no, this is, you know, we're Marxists, and so our version, there has to be this process by which we'll get there eventually, but for now we need this rigorous, centralized, you know.
Is Emma Goldman, I'm paraphrasing, but is Emma Goldman the, if I can't dance to it, then it's not my solution, right?
Yes, that's her,
That's a great,
and so
great,
she was an awesome lady. Her books, there's a couple of great books about her, but so she goes, and then, you know, basically anyone that's further to the left of the communists, right, in Russia starts getting basically purged, right? So there was, like, Nestor Makhno was an anarchist in the Ukraine. The Ukraine was much more anarchist than it was communist, and you know, and so initially during the revolution, they're all kind of fighting together against the Tsarist forces. But then, as soon as the communists are in power, they start to push the anarchists out and just execute them or make sure they have as little say as possible. And so that's why the anarchists in Spain would have been very concerned, because we've already seen this happen in Russia. This is the way that that version of communism works. And then they've slung Trotsky out at this point. Trotsky's kind of wandering around the world trying to foment revolution back against Stalin. And that
ice picks.
Yeah, exactly. It was Mexico that he got stabbed in the face. I think
It's
crazy. And so I think that's the background that informs why and there's also this there's been a successful revolution in the north of Spain. Like they have. I mean, he describes that at the beginning of the book when he first comes to Barcelona. He's like, "Holy crap, this is what it looks like. This is the future we're fighting for, and it's here. It exists right now."
Even then, just to re-emphasize his X-ray vision. Even then, he can't help himself. He's like, "No, this is good. I like this. This is great." But at the same time, not entirely comfortable
right.
with going into stores and staff not referring to me as senor. And
yes.
It's great.
Yes.
It's great. I really admire. He really can't help in a way that you wonder. Because all these things come round in waves and cycles and stuff. And I'm wondering if there was an Orwell now, it would be really bad timing for him, because I think his own sense of honesty would get him into trouble.
Because he could never toe any party line. He could never toe.
He would get cancelled, I think, for saying for not,
towing the party line, whatever it is at the moment.
Not manning the barricades, right? He'd be like, so he's fascinating. I remember reading an article as well. I tried to find it for this, but I read a book. I can't even find the book. There's a quite interesting book about how basically in its kind of fight against, I can't even exactly remember the thesis of the book, but it was to do with how the CIA backed certain leftist literary types during the Cold War to kind of stop them from going over to the other side and
right
to keep the dialogue. It's quite interesting, like things like the Paris Review and
right,
like there was, and there's an interesting chapter in that how, because again we were talking about, so sorry, I'm not making myself, I'm tying myself up in knots here. So for instance, we were talking about loyalty to the cause, and so lots of people on the left considered Orwell a bit of a traitor.
Oh yes, when he started criticizing Russia.
Sure. and not, and also oddly enough, another person who kind of went from hero to villain is Malcolm Muggeridge, right? Malcolm Muggeridge was an early, he was one of the people like Gareth Jones, he got off the train in Ukraine and saw what was happening and then went back and said, holy fuck, this collectivization, woohoo, not a good idea. He was one of the first, and he was, pilloried by the rest, but he was quite right. And of course later on ended up, going on TV to debate with Monty Python and becoming a bad guy, pantomime or whatever. But it's interesting how I think even to this day, because so much of the rich life of British literary left at that time, because they chose sides, the almost subsequent generations have sided with certain people, right? So you will still get articles now, like this chapter in this book, which and it wasn't exactly. It was an interesting article because it wasn't as if they drank the Kool-Aid. It wasn't, total nonsense. But they were making the point how if George Orwell had lived, because again, that's the other thing you forget about George Orwell, because he
died young.
Well, he died very young as well. Like he was 50, right? He fell into a fucking whirlpool in Scotland or something, right? It was just like.
I thought he just died of TB. What? Really?
No, he did. maybe that's not what killed him, but that might have been the cause. We probably should
Okay,
have looked
what?
this up,
Yes,
but,
sure, okay.
yeah. But yes, I know what you mean. That sounds like, was there a Kraken involved? Edgar Allan Poe kind of.
It was a Stalinist Kraken. Yeah, it been sent there by.
Or whatever that is in the at the means of it. Anyway, so and they were making the argument, if Orwell had lived, like how actually would he have ended up crossing over?
Yeah, we voted for
Quite far
Thatcher.
to the right.
You
And
know,
it's an
it's hard,
interesting
it's hard to
thing
know.
he did there.
But I don't know about, because funnily enough, later on, after his kind of revulsion at the Stalinist kind of way of doing things, which, you know, is clear that's what Animal Farm is all about, right? I mean,
Yes.
it all comes out of his experience of seeing it in action, seeing the way that version of communism.
That was a CIA backed the animated version as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So, you know, certainly, yeah, it was used. But I mean, he was always frustrated and annoyed that it was, you know, it was being used to in a blanket way, say socialism is bad, when he's like, oh, but I am a socialist. I'm just a more democratic socialist. I don't believe in totalitarianism, right? Alexa off. So I think that, I mean, because, you know, we know that the political spectrum is kind of a circle, right? You go far enough, right, and, you know, you get to fascism or you get to Stalinism, and they're basically, what's the difference to the common person, right? You're living in fear of secret police.
And I agree with you. I would like to think that he was almost immune to that, just because he seemed immune to everything else.
Well, I was just going to say, when he, like, not long before he died, he said, basically, in looking back, he said that the anarchists were right in virtually everything. He was not willing to quite ever call himself fully like an anarchist, but he basically said, politically speaking, that is the philosophy that I now see as being the most honest and potentially decent.
Right.
So that doesn't speak to me as somebody who's going, I mean, who knows, you know, 30 more years later, yes, maybe.
Yeah,
but hard to say.
No, I think
if you've seen all that immigration coming out of, you know, the Caribbean, who knows? It's interesting where people go when their version of England or whatever starts to change, right?
That's the thing. That's the thing, because he doesn't strike me as, I wouldn't have said George Orwell was in any way, shape, or form a racist, but certainly he did have.
The Brit, like, just I don't know what you call it, a parochial British kind of thing that goes on, you know, the assumption that England knows best, which comes up in the book in a way. Every now and again, like he kind of makes fun of, like, oh, well, at least Spanish fascism will be very disorganized. Like, there's these kind of, like, almost a kind of a Manuel Fawlty Towers vision of the Spanish and their ability to, you know, get things done.
Even in Burmese days, for example, he's never entirely fully kind of doesn't entirely dispel this idea of the, you know, the white man's burden and the Pakistani and all that. It's more that, oh, they're going about it the wrong way, rather than, what the fuck are you doing this for at all?
Yes. That's not a kindly version of, Again,
that's what comes with this X-ray vision and being honest to a fault, and just I've never read but I ordered it immediately, because I've never read The Road to Wigan Pier either.
Oh yes, that's a great. Full of lists, which is hilarious.
Yeah, watching the stuff
about how much things cost and so on.
Well, watching the stuff about that on the Arena documentaries, that sounds very much like, you know, he's there, and he's very much, you know, he's a champion of these, you know, but then at the same time, he's like talking about like some family he's staying with, and the in a tripe shop, and the main, you know, the man of the house, his hands are always black, and like just every time he makes like a sandwich or something, there's invariably a black thumbprint in it on the bread. And it's just, I love how he refuses to how much humility he gives the working man, at the same time he can't resist saying, but you're a filthy motherfucker.
Yeah, wash your hands, for God's sake. There's a great bit in that book that was one of those moments in my life where it was like almost getting like a slap in the back of the head or something. There's a point in that book where he says, like, oh, you know, they believe all these things about, you know, these, like, the workers, you know, like, oh, you know, you can't give them decent council housing because they'll just put coal in the bathtubs. And And I had heard that exact thing said to me as a kid growing up in, and there's, quite some years later, in Ireland about our itinerants, and basically like, oh, you can't give the travelers houses because they'll just put coal in the bathroom, like that exact line.
Yeah, yeah.
I was like,
well, it's
okay. And I just taken it as face value. As a kid, I was kind of like, oh yeah, I guess that's why, when, that I read it in the Road to Wikipedia, I'm like, okay.
Well, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy thing, after a while, right? You're like, well, if you're going to treat us like that, then
we're just going to be, we're going to be your worst nightmare. But I'll say the things that jumped out at me this time that I didn't remember at all that I loved were at one point he describes like how he gets sick of being run across by these kind of rats the size of like, cats and stuff like that. And at one point he punches one, and he's talking about how satisfying it was to feel his fist connect with this fat rat that was running across his body. And that
the lice as well.
Oh, crawling all over your balls. Yeah. You came back to that a few times in the book. Obviously it was and then he describes how he goes back to Barcelona and fully gets deloused, and he's like back like half a day and they're already back in his pants.
Yeah.
Like
just, no, it's great.
And the constant smell of shit, like just like everything stinks of just excrement and rotten food, and
escapes him, right? And how as well the town, like you mentioned when you first arrive, and it's it's totally this is what a working man's paradise looks like, and then not very long after that, when the front has kind of moved on and the town's kind of gone back to its old ways, it's like that, right? It's like, and
that is also, but that is an effect of the decision made by, because he talks about this kind of clearly, that that basically Stalin had made this decision that that Russia came first, and that they weren't going to encourage revolutions in other countries because they needed to have trade relations with other countries and so on.
Right.
And so basically the Stalinist line was, we don't want a revolution in Spain. So don't have one. So basically all they're doing is undermining the revolution. And Orwell's argument as the book goes on is that if you take away the revolution, then you take away the reason to fight against Franco. To the people who want to fight Franco, you're just saying, well, we're just going to give you a slightly watered down version of the same. It's just going to be the same capitalism, the same hierarchies. The Catholic Church is still going to be,
which is eventually what happened, right? You could, I mean, the Franco-fascism was, I mean, yes, I'm sure it wasn't great fun, but it wasn't quite the fascism of.
It wasn't, because it didn't have the racial component, I think, of certainly what was going on in Germany, and then but I don't know that it was that different than what was going on in Italy. I think. I think there was a lot of people murdered. There was a lot of, particularly right at the end of the Civil War, was just a massive slaughter. I mean, a huge loss of life. So, I mean, there's some really interesting books I would recommend if you ever want to know about like what happened next, like what happened in that period of time. Like this book is an incredible book. So Sabate, if that's how you say his name. He was basically a guerrilla who fought. He was an anarchist guerrilla who fought like basically his own one-man Spanish Civil War for like years and years and years after, right into the 1950s, and constantly like escaping in the most ridiculous ways. Like it's almost unbelievable to read a story, and yet apparently it is true. Right. And they did make a movie based roughly on, because he robbed banks in order to kind of keep money, to keep fighting fascism. So when they finally made a movie about him, they cast John Saxon. And they basically just made him a bank robber. Like they didn't. So they have these scenes that if you've read the book, you're like, oh yeah, I know where that. But they completely decontextualized any politics from the movie. I can't remember what it's called, but I'm sure I could find out for you.
I'll find out. No, because that's almost crying out for what's his face? Thomas Howell's dad.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, definitely. That would be a great Thomas Millian.
Why is it Thomas Millian? Yeah, and a Sergio Solima script rather than John Saxon and the way they do it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically just a kind of a polizio, like a Spanish polizio film. But then there's also this, which is really interesting. Stuart Christie, who was he was a Scottish anarchist, who at the age of 18 this is I think in the early 60s, goes to Spain to kill Franco.
Wow.
And yeah, so this young Scotsman, and I think I remember a part in the book, I read this many years ago, but he described how he'd packed his kilt with him, and then it came out in the newspapers that he was a cross-dresser, that he was a transvestite who'd come to kill Franco.
Wow.
And he was very upset about this. He was like, no,
Right.
it was just my kilt.
It's interesting.
And then
I've never thought about that. So the cross section between, if you're a transvestite and a Scotsman, then
right,
you could get away with it in plain sight,
yeah,
right? Without
yep, arousing any suspicion. But he also then later on, when he ends up in Spanish prison for some years as like a young man, which is a weird thing for a Scotsman to be in, fascist prison in Spain,
right,
in the 60s. And then he goes back to England and he gets involved with the Angry Brigade, who you may be aware of as well. Yeah, so anyway, that's quite a good.
They were all like this.
Yeah, and also
people who were always furious.
When he came back in, he had to show up at the police station to explain that he'd been in prison, and they're like, "What's your name?" And he's like, "Stuart Christie," and their immediate response is like,
right.
Yeah,
With the next question, Donald with your trousers.
Yes, exactly. So there's that, and then there's this, which would be the last book I would recommend, which is about Durruti, Buenaventura Durruti, which is probably the greatest anarchist general, I guess, of the Spanish Civil War, and just a fascinating guy. He was in South America, where he was involved in all kinds of stuff, and he's just
and then made great records for Factory Records.
Yes. The Durruti column, I'm pretty sure, are just they're named after his column. But yeah, so I don't think that Spanish fascism was a huge amount of fun. As I said, it wasn't at the scale of what the Nazis did, but I don't think it was a good time either.
The one thing, because obviously we could blather on so many, and I deliberately was trying to keep things concise as well, but I kind of got away from us a bit. But the main thing I wanted to get across personally myself was that how much I really now truly appreciate Orwell's gift of this incorruptible seeming
yes. And it's this weird mix of reportage and literature. Like it reads great as a book, as a novel, and it's like.
Well, that leads into what one last thing I just wanted to mention as well, because I thought it was kind of interesting, was, and I'm not sure, I didn't have a chance to look it up. I'm not sure at what point in publishing history this happened, if it was between editions or it was between the manuscript and the first edition. But basically, so the version that most of us will read now, you have like the bulk of the book, which is about 200 pages, and then you have some appendices, a couple of appendices. And specifically, the first appendix, from what I understand, was originally, so now you have, the way you read it now, you have 12 chapters and then the appendices. But apparently in the original version, what is now Appendix 1 would have been the original Chapter 5 between chapters 4 and 6. And this is the chapter that kind of gives you more of the political context.
Yes, yeah.
And I think it's actually quite clever the way they've done it, because what they've done by moving it into the appendix is the bulk of the story actually reads much smoother, doesn't it? It's like and I understand why he wanted, because it would have seemed like, oh, hang on now, you need to know who these people are. But by moving it to the back of the book does make a hell of a lot more sense. And I'm not sure if this happened between the manuscript and the first edition or between editions, or I don't know if you know.
I'm not sure, when.
No. But it struck me as just a good example of, I don't know, and I don't know if it was his idea of someone's, Eric, should we, or I don't know, but it's a good example of like you said, that kind of care taken to, on top of being this, this amazingly kind of almost omniscient kind of narrator that kind of sees all, and even if you don't see it, then you admit you don't see it, or
Yes,
just on top of that, like you said, the care taken to like, this has to read well as well. This has to work as a piece of art,
as a book.
Which is just, but it doesn't get in the way of it. It's not like pretentious or anything. It's all serving the greater good of making this understandable, and it's really transmitting information to you above all else, and understanding that doing it in a way which is, well, it's just well done, right? It's just well presented, is going to get that information in there. Because you're talking about a lot of these other books, for example, and I'm sure there's many books that if you want to know the facts, but how much of it is going to stick?
Yes, you don't feel like you've lived. Yes, but you feel like you lived it almost alongside of Orwell when you read, and in fact, some of the most affecting.
In my pants now.
Yes, exactly. Some of the most affecting parts of the book for me upon rereading it are this kind of there's this acknowledgement as the book goes on that he's never quite sure if he's killed anybody. He may have, right? But in that fog of war, he's never quite sure. And then, near the beginning of the book, he kind of says, like, if every one of us just killed one fascist, we'd have this problem dealt with, which seems really strident, when you kind of look at it now. But it's also it's true. Yeah, that would have worked. But then, his descriptions of being under fire and about that, that the kind of fear involved, like it's very good that way.
From his own side as well, more than anything.
Oh yes, exactly, yes. And then that the part where he finally does get wounded, or when he gets shot through the throat, is quite, it's a great. I mean, I don't ever want to be shot in the throat, but I feel like I have a sense of what it would be like having read that.
That whole passage as well is it's a bit of it's a shame I can't find it. It's a bit of a microcosm actually of what makes him great, because it only takes up about a page and a half or something, again, but it goes through this phase very quickly of, oh fuck, have my artery been shot? Am I dying? Oh no, I'm not. Oh, I feel sorry for these poor guys who have to carry me.
Yes,
what you just shot? It's amazing, and I don't know how much of that was, but it feels as if it's almost as if he's writing it in the stretcher, right? Like he's got a fantastic recall of where his mind went.
Yes, yeah,
and that's remarkable to me. Like there's no self-pity.
No, not at all.
I don't know how much of a reliable. He might have been a whiny fuck on the actual field. Who knows? It's entirely possible that he's kind of making it up. But I get it does. Other people survived the war. I mean, as I said, who would have been with him? So right.
So yeah, I think and it's funny too. He mentions a couple of times having a fierce argument with some other English guy, and I always wondered what that was about. There's no specifics, but it's one of the few moments where. And then the other thing that is quite nice is he is very, other than the occasional snide remark about, mañana and the kind of Spanish, lackadaisical attitudes, but he is generally speaking very positive about Spain and Spaniards.
He says
that there's a decency there.
He says something along the lines of, like they have 19th century manners. He says something along the lines of, like, I had many evil times in Spain, but I very rarely got angry with the Spaniards.
Yes. Yeah. Even when they were shooting at him,
Right.
And they were supposed to be on the same side. I mean, the descriptions of the Barcelona, the kind of the fighting, and then building the barricades out of the. I think there was a line where he talked about how they should number the paving slabs because of the number of times that they're constantly pulling them up to the barricades and then having to put them back down again 3 days later.
Much slower process, right? It's like, oh shit, where's this go again? Kind of,
one of the things I had gone to look for before, but I couldn't find it. I many years ago bought from like the infancy of eBay a beautiful oversized kind of poster book that was made by the anarchists in 1936 to celebrate the revolution. It was full of these huge color lithographs of like heroic soldiers waving flags. And, you know, one of the things that's interesting is how much on the anarchist side of things, women were given, like women were allowed to fight in the militias, women were, you know, given a far more active role in the revolution. And then again, once the Stalinists came in, that was, nope, get back to your kitchens, you know. So in that way, as I said, it, you know, it's nothing's perfect, but most of the people who went there and saw it, you know, it's for everyone who's always questioned, well, can anarchism work? Well, the answer is always, well, it did for a while. You know, we don't know how long it would have lasted, how long it could have, if it could have stood the test of time, but certainly for that 6 months or whatever, that first year in northern Spain, it seemed to function just fine until it had the legs taken out from under it by the Stalinists and by the, you know.
It's interesting as well. The other thing that he brings up as well is early on, he talks about when everyone's on an equal footing is how the army functions in a very different way. And he makes an interesting point. And again, because he's so honest, and because he goes back and forth with it a little bit, and he's not, you know, he doesn't specifically come down on one. It's interesting. He makes a point. People say the army can't be run in this way because you need to, you know, delegate authority, and and you need someone. You need. And another point you mentioned is that because everyone was a major, because no one could be promoted higher than
right.
But he also said, well, at first it's kind of chaotic, but then it does kind of, there seems to be like a certain amount of, I think the one thing about maybe the right in general, and maybe not even as far as fascism, but in terms of a certain conservatism, is it always strikes me that part of it ingrained in it is like an impatience. So he points out, whereas it's like, well, some guy might not follow your order. Fuck that, I'm not doing that. And if you have the patience, then, and you're not so concerned with looking like you have to, you know, hand out discipline, and you know, you're not worried about, you know, looking weak, or after a certain amount of time and arguing, and maybe a week later, maybe that person will reluctantly, you know, carry on. Oh, okay, I will, you know. And it's interesting, and you're thinking, well, that's kind of one of the components of conservatism, and certainly fascism, is like zero, like, I don't have time, but I instant. There's amount to be said.
Gratification.
In certain situations, you know, it might be expedient to actually not, you know, sit around
have to discuss everything. But that's consensus is a difficult thing, but it ultimately is more.
It works in the long term, right? It works in the long term, but unfortunately, I suppose increasingly, our world doesn't work in the long term. We're working in this increasingly kind of,
which is, I mean, you know, we're getting further and further away in that way. But there's a great essay, I think it's by George Woodcock, who's another anarchist, called "The Tyranny of the Clock," and just the fact that we've only been measuring time by minutes and seconds for a relatively short chunk of human existence, and that it's largely to do with capitalism, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean,
so,
and you know, Mussolini did make the trains run on time, right?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. There you go. So, but you know, I would say, you know, if we're gonna to bring it back to the book,
we probably should.
Everyone should read Homage. It's just nice. This is one that I think we're absolutely in agreement, as we were last time, actually, absolutely in agreement. With our last book, the Japanese
Tales of Moon and Rain.
Tales of Moon. Yeah. You know, this is a book that, you know, you shouldn't miss Homage to Catalonia. It's a great piece of writing.
It's in the canon, right? It's in so many different, and I will read it again, and I'll go through all the copious notes I made, and I'm going to read around it. And I noticed as well, I suppose in closing, this might be up, I noticed an obituary 2 or 3 weeks ago. The last known surviving member of the International Brigades died.
Oh wow.
He
Okay.
was, 101, and a Spanish, and he must have been 15 or 16 or something.
Yeah, they would. I
in
mean, they would have been
1946.
teenagers. A lot of
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
But yeah, he died. Apparently he was the last kind of known surviving kind of name. Yeah, he died a couple of weeks ago. So I suppose, yeah, kind of brings a era to a close.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A sad ending for our, but
Yeah.
I guess it's, you know, really the book. I mean, that's, I guess I should say, the book is written before the end of the Spanish Civil War, which is also a
Right.
fascinating thing because he's still hopeful that maybe they'll get it together and maybe they'll be able to stop Franco.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting to me that he never wrote. I mean, maybe he felt like with these books that they were kind of time capsules or whatever, that he never came back and wrote anything like
Right.
a postscript or anything to say like, oh well.
Well, I
You know?
suppose not specifically on this, but again, if we're talking about the idea that he might have gone cross over to the right, or maybe chose what was required, you know, rather than be politically partisan, you kind of allied yourself with what was necessary at the time. He did
Mhm.
write a pamphlet during the Second World War called The Lion and the Unicorn. And he makes an interesting point about, in his opinion, he writes about how the British are kind of like a family.
Mhm.
And even though he might not necessarily have been a Churchillian,
Right.
he makes a point of like, okay, this is when we need
Yeah.
solidarity. Like,
Right.
above all else,
Yes.
we're
Yes.
not going to get through this if we
Yeah.
bicker amongst ourselves. And it's kind
Yeah.
of fascinating, again, especially coming from him. It's, you know, once you've, I mean, life's so complicated, right? And you throw history into the mix as well, that when you find a hero, when you find someone, you grab hold of them, right? Because
Mhm.
fucking please explain this to me. It's like a lifeline. So, and very few of them don't betray you. And whether it's
Right.
because he died young and he didn't have a chance to, or whether because he was, you know, the real deal. Orwell, I feel as if Orwell never betrayed us. And
Yes.
yes.
And you know, there's two last things I think I want to say, connection to him. There's somebody else once wrote of him that he was a man who couldn't blow his nose without considering the plight of handkerchief makers in Bangladesh, kind of a thing. Like he was just, you know, it was an immediate. He had this mind that always went to how people suffered, and that's the one place where would have a hard time imagining him, because it almost always comes out from back to Burmese days, you know, or the shooting of an elephant, you know, that essay, things like that. There's always this kind of instinctive, like, revulsion at violence that's done kind of downwards, you know, from people in
Right.
positions of authority or power down towards the people who are powerless.
Punching down.
And yeah, punching, exactly. And I do feel like in that way, he would have looked at the miners' strikes, you know, during, if he lived that long into the early 80s kind of a thing. I don't think he would have been very happy with Thatcher's treatment
No, no.
of, you know,
But at the
like
same time, he would have complained about them filling the bathtubs full of coal.
I think he was pointing out that was bullshit in the book. That's why it struck me as being like, if he could see that.
I don't know though, because I think I don't know the specific passage you're referring to because I haven't read it yet. But
I'm fairly certain that he was saying
not shy,
this is what they say.
He's obviously not shy to point these things out, right? Like when you live up to your stereotypes, for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no. Can you imagine? I'd love to. You almost want an Orwell. You want an Orwell to write about Silicon Valley. You want an Orwell to write about football hooliganism. You want, you know.
Yeah, someone who has that keen perspective, but also that coming from that place of.
And I think until you, because there's lots of great writers, obviously, but I think until you immerse yourself in or read one of his really great books like this, I don't think you realize quite until you realize how few and far between,
Mm-hmm.
you know, really, really reliable kind of.
You know, I should he wrote about Celine as well, which is fascinating because obviously Celine was, you know, was a virulent anti-Semite and got involved in, you know, all manner of, you know, trouble for having apparently supported the Nazis when they invaded France and so on. But because of who Orwell was, he was, you know, he was really interested in literature and writing, and in the writing of politics, and you know,
literary criticism is.
Yeah, and so he wrote. I think he writes an essay where he compares Celine and Henry Miller, who had kind of lifted a certain amount of Celine's style,
right,
you know, but then appropriated it for more sexy. Anyway, yeah, I'm sure I remember reading that way back then when I probably had never read any Celine. It's probably would be worth maybe checking out now.
Yeah, especially since I've read some Celine. Actually, you turned me on Celine, and I've greatly enjoyed it. And I've never really got on with Henry Miller.
No, me neither.
Anyway, let's finish there. Maybe we'll get to Celine in a future episode.
Yeah, a future episode. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
All right.
This has been Literary Arts Feck. He's been
Nicholas O'Shea,
and I've been Clive Davis. And we'll be back in another couple of weeks with some more literary feckness.
Absolutely. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
All 6 of you. And one of you is me.
See ya.
See ya.